Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Marc Lamont Hill. I am the owner of Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books. I'm also the moderator of tonight's event. I am very, very excited to welcome you all to our our latest in a long series of amazing book talks. Every week, we bring together some of the most brilliant, insightful, cutting edge, innovative, creative, inspirational writers who come and talk to us about their books. And tonight is no exception. In fact, you know what? It is an exception because most of these people I don't even know, and I like the books I don't even know. But today is an extra special honor because I am joined by the author of an amazing new book. The book is called "Not Paved for Us." Educate Black educators in public school reform in Philadelphia. I'm gonna say that again, not paved for us. Black educators and public school reform in Philadelphia. And the author is the great Dr. Camika Royal. And I gotta say, this might be my favorite book talk to ever do. I'm not gonna cry because I'm a thug, but what I am gonna say is that I don't even know how many years ago it's been now. Lord, my God,
15.
It's been 15? 15 years ago, I met Camika. I was her doctoral advisor at Temple University in the urban education program. And so to watch Camika go from the first day of the interview to the first day of classes to the first day of our advising session, which didn't go quite as smooth as we probably would have wanted. But to go from that to her writing a brilliant dissertation, to her having getting a wonderful job, to her getting tenure, to her publishing a book based on her brilliant research on Harvard Education Press, I couldn't be more proud. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. I couldn't be more proud and more excited to have you here, Camika. Welcome to Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books. And thank you so much for sharing this work, this research with us and with the world.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here with you. Thank you for the years we didn't get along, the couple of years, but thank you for the plethora of years that we had. And thank you for being my friend and for just reading and giving me feedback and insight. And thank you.
This is the pleasure is all mine. I mean, the reward for all the work that we do in the world is watching the world be better. And I think this book leaves us better. It leaves us smarter. It leaves us better equipped to understand not just Philadelphia and that complicated, messy history of Philadelphia education and the school district leadership, but it really prepares all of us who care about justice, who care about education, who care about schooling, who care about leadership, who care about cities, to really understand how we can how an analysis of the past brings us somewhere new. So I'm going to start by asking you the question that I like to ask almost everybody who comes, and that is, why this book and why now?
Woo! Why this book? Why this book for me is very personal and political. So as a native Philadelphian, Southwest Philly, born and raised in Penrose specifically, I was very much loved by elders at Old Enon Tabernacle Baptist Church on Coulter Street, where my parents were married in 1968. And growing up at that church in the 80s and 90s, I had the most beautiful, brilliant Black elders who just were part of this village that my sister, my family, and I belonged to, and just loved on me and sort of supported me and stood in the gap for my parents. My sister and I are first generation college. So there were some things that my parents just didn't know about how to access those things. And we had these wonderful people. So fast forward years after I leave Philly, come back, and I'm starting my second semester as a doctoral student at Temple. And Dr. Bill Cutler, who apparently just had a birthday, shout out to him, I'm in his Origins of Urban Education class, and we're reading about the voluntary transfer program for Black Philly educators in 1964. And he says, you all have to do an original research project, and I'm going to take you to the urban archives. I was like, I don't need to go to no archives. I know the people who lived through this, who taught through this. And so I began to tap into those elders. And I just spent the next 14, 15 years listening to their stories. And it's just been, this book mattered to me because I feel like, first of all, I ride for my city, right? There's nowhere in the world like Philadelphia. I don't care where you put me. I'm still gonna be like, I'm a Philly Joan, and it better not be a problem, right? Because you don't want that smoke. But I felt like this was a way to put Philly on in my small little way, but also to honor the elders who sort of came before our present moment. And I would say our contemporaries who are doing the work right now, in spite of these systems continuing to try to do everything they can to take away democracy, to take away our liberty, to take away our freedoms in our lives, right? To sort of squelch opportunity for Black people and Black communities. I wanted to bring this, and I wanted this book to be out sooner than now, but I think this present moment is actually perfect, right? God clearly knew what he was doing with all these delays over time as we begin to switch from, the superintendent. So one leaving after 10 years and a new one coming in now. I think this is the perfect moment and I could not have planned it any better.
No, you absolutely couldn't have. There's so many things I love about the book, right? But you take us through significant moments of leadership changes. So you don't just say, okay, this was the superintendent from 67 to 71, and this is the one from 71 to 82. Although you do that, each moment seems to match up with a particular understanding of the relationship between race and school reform. And there's a big picture argument you're making that I think is really important, right? Which is, so help us first, before we get into each moment, I know there's a bunch of Philadelphia folk out here that can't wait to talk about some of these folks, especially Frank Rizzo. I know I can't wait. But talk to me a little bit about what your book will teach us about the role of race in terms of how we think about education reform in school districts.
About a year ago, you and I sat on BNC and talked about race theory in schools. And there's always, I think about critical race theories, sort of analysis of neutrality, right? That neutrality doesn't exist, that meritocracy is a farce. But this idea has so permeated all of education, right? That we need to be neutral, we're going to be unbiased, schools need to be political free, and so, free of politics. And so the first thing I would say is that this book argues that there is no freedom from any of those things. All schooling is political, all reform is inherently political, all is inherently political, as is our gender identity, even if that's on the spectrum, as is our class identity, right? And those things matter for how reform is not, before it's even enacted, before how reform is imagined. It matters for how it is interpreted and received. It matters for how it's implemented. And that, I think Philadelphia is a story that actually speaks to some things that, are happening in different places, but you then have to sort of overlay the characters of that place. So One of the books I loved, I got to teach this past fall, is Elizabeth Todd Breland's Political Education, where she's talking about Black education, the politics of Black education in Chicago from the 1960s forward. There are some similarities between Chicago and Philadelphia, but Chicago has its own sort of racial and socio-political history, right? You cannot tease those things out from school reform. It's embedded not just in Chicago politics, just like Philadelphia reform is not just rooted in Philadelphia politics, but it's also rooted in a global politic, right? Of what's happening to Black people around the globe and our freedom movements. And that's what I appreciate about this book, that it tells the story of a city, but that story actually speaks to what's happening in a lot of our cities, not just in this nation, but around the world, and how we as a people begin to sort of strategize and sort of hold off, if you will, in some ways, and in other ways fight back. against the reforms that are being imposed on us. And then at times, how some of us pick up the ball of the oppressor and carry forth the tools of our own oppression.
Ooh, so let's start with Marc Shedd, because he's a fascinating figure. And before you get to the kind of 70s where a whole lot of stuff was happening and that people seem to know about, there's this interesting moment from 1967 to 1971 in the school district. Who is Marc Shedd, and why is he so central to understanding racial school reform?
Marc Shedd was a young guy. Let's start out with that. So Marc Shedd was younger. You know, I like to tease you because you my old head. And so Marc Shedd was actually younger than you and I are right now. So I want to start with that, right? He's 41 years old. He's seen as this smart, young, white guy coming from Harvard. And, you know, he's kind of, there's some pictures of him. But, you know, he's like this young, like, hey, I'm going to come into the city and I'm going to shake it up. And he connects to Richardson Dilworth, for, you know, folks who may be familiar with Dilworth Plaza, you know, going ice skating down there or whatever. Dilworth, who had been mayor of Philadelphia, who at the moment when Shedd comes is now head of the school board. So this elder statesman in Richardson Dilworth says, we really just need to reform the schools. And so we need to bring in this young white guy to shake it up. Right. Which you got to love white liberals for that. We have this issue of racial oppression, right, where we've been consistently oppressing Black people, brown people, right, immigrants. I know what we'll do to shake it up. We'll bring in a young white guy. Right? When you had Marcus Foster right there in the city, right? So I always have to put that. You have Marcus Foster right there. But instead, you go out the city and get a Marc Shedd. Marc Shedd comes in. He's a young white guy with all these ideas, great ideas. I think he had very little. I don't think he knew enough about Philadelphia. I don't think he was ready to face opposition led by someone like Frank Rizzo. They come to the city, or they start leading the school department, right? The district and the police force. They start leading them at the same time, both in 1967. Mm-hmm. Right. And part of my argument is that they're actually, which I know is going to make a lot of white people upset, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. Only Marc Shedd doesn't know it. Right. Marc Shedd thinks he's advocating for Black folks. But when the funk hits the fan, he's preserving, you know, this system under the guise of equality.
So let's talk about some of the ways that happens, because you raise that's another really important point, that some of these policy reforms were race neutral, ostensibly, right? These were just policies to get rid of long-term substitutes, right? We want to raise the intellectual base of the school district. So we're going to get rid of these long-term subs. We're going to get rid of anybody who didn't pass the teacher's exam. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And this is going to make the district smarter and get better qualified teachers. That was the argument. And this has nothing to do with race. But
it always has to do with race. I mean, even sitting there listening to you say it, right? It makes me think of the Indian boarding schools. Right? Yeah. And so the same thing keeps happening over and over again. Somehow you think you're going to save the children of a people by separating them from the adults of this same people. Right. From demonizing their parents, their cousins, their neighbors, their loved ones, and saying these people aren't good enough for you. So who is it you think, what kind of genius are you going to turn out when you are trying to remove them and separate them from the very people who sustain their life every day? Mm-hmm. Right. It's the type of thing that wasn't thought out, but you had a test and you thought, oh, this test is going to raise the standard. Right. But when you start to sort of pull it back, you start to see how Black folks are being set out of the district that we most, you know, it was like 67% Black students at that time.
Jesus. I think about November 17th, 1967.
Yeah.
And November 17th is obviously a very important date. It's not just the infamous day that Omega Psi Phi was founded, but it's also a date in 1967 where students protest.
Yeah.
And they're demanding school reform, but the kind of reforms they're demanding are in the interests of Black folk. So how does a school district, I'm thinking this is 1967.
Yeah.
I mean, Malcolm X has been killed. Dr. King is demanding more, right? There's a war in Vietnam. There's Black Panthers in chapters all around the country. And there's a radical shift in the country. And students are in the streets asking for
3,500 of them.
And what's Philly
with no social media, right? Organizing themselves from around the country, showing up down 21st in the Parkway with their demands, with their signs. Like, we deserve something better than this. Right? And these are the folks who are now our elders. When you think about the fact that was 55 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. And how does the school district's vision of reform match up with what the students are demanding on the ground? And I ask this because right now we're seeing a similar thing. We've had walkouts in the last decade. We've had student protests right now. We have the Philadelphia Student Union right now, which is constantly applying pressure on the district. And it seems to me that historically there's been a gap between what the schools want to do and what the students are, or sometimes even the teachers are asking for. So how are we negotiating this?
Always. The first thing is that adults always try to infantilize children. So I was talking, even in my own family, I was talking to one of my family members who she just turned 8. All right. I'm Aunt Mika and I adore her. And there are things that she asks questions about. And my position is, if she's asking the question, there's a reason why. Right. And what I suspect is that her friends are already talking about it. And my job is to make sure, if she's coming to Aunt Mika, right, that I'm giving her an answer, that she doesn't have to seek answer from her friends instead. I think when we deal with young people, and this was especially the case in 1967, you have somebody like a Shed who's like, yes, let them protest. But that's coming up against this law and order police chief who's like, absolutely not. Right? They're children. They belong in school. So we have a long history of infantilizing young people and assuming that they can't ask, right? That they don't have a right to ask or to demand something different from their government. I think it's the highest form of citizenship to get out there and be in the street. You couldn't ask for people to be more engaged than that.
Yeah. Talk to me about this police chief, right? Because I don't care where you are in the country, you may have heard of Frank Rizzo. If you're from this neck of the woods, you can't not have heard of Frank Rizzo. Mayor of Philadelphia from, I believe, was it 71 or 72 to 80 or something like that. But before he was mayor, he was a police chief.
Yep.
Whose tenure as police chief and then mayor seemed to shape school district policy. So who was he and why is he such a relevant figure in the book? And I got to add, for y'all, Camika's book chapter titles. So the first title is called Fear of a Black School District. And the second one, which is about Mark Shedd and racial school reform, the second one is called Thug Life, Frank Rizzo's Law and Disorder. So y'all notice a hip hop pattern here too. But talk to me about why you call it Thug Life, who Frank Rizzo is and why this is relevant.
I see Frank Rizzo as the ultimate thug. And let me just say, when the year that we were both 13 years old, I believe you were 12 at the moment, but the year that we were both 13 years old, in the summer of 1991, I'm home getting ready to start Central High School, right? I'm watching all my children. And they interrupt, or like As the World Turns or something, because I feel like I was watching Channel 10, and they interrupted to say that Frank Rizzo has died. And at the time, he was campaigning to run for mayor again, this time as a Republican. So I'm like confused, like, why they take the stories off? What's happening? I will never forget this moment because I'm calling my parents like, yo, I'm just trying to watch what's happening with Reva and Josh on Guiding Light. Like, why are they got he was, I think, this larger than life and still in some circles larger than life figure. I mean, and sort of theoretically, but also like that statue. That huge statue that people had to fight to get taken down in front of the Municipal Services Building. I'm told that my grandfather, who passed away in 1981, was a Rizzo supporter, which I find very interesting, right? But it's part of the reason why, isms often run together. So where you find racism, you will find sexism, you will find classism, and when you have an identity that you're trying to figure out what it means to be a man and to be an uneducated man in the 1960s and 70s. And you see somebody like Frank Rizzo, who, was giving out jobs left and right to people who would do little things for him. I understand, like he gave my grandfather the homie hookup a couple times. But I call it thug life because he is who I see as the ultimate thug, walking around with a baton in his cummerbund, making young black men strip on the street after a police officer was killed. Some of the language he used about his opponents. He had several open cases around police brutality when he was running for mayor.
Yeah.
I don't know of bigger thugs than police. And Frank Rizzo, to my knowledge, was the biggest thug of them all.
So how does having this kind of explicit, when he ran in his last campaign, he literally was saying vote white, right? And to be clear, for those that say, well, there's always racists out there, he was going to win. Rizzo was likely going, Ed Rendell likely would not have been mayor had Frank Rizzo not died, right? So it's going to be a successful campaign, right? How do you negotiate that, right? How do you do school reform when the mayor is somebody who's telling people to vote white? How do you do school reform when he's out there beating up and advocating the beating of black and not just black, all activists who are challenging police brutality, ironically? How did school reform look as we go from the late 60s to the early 70s in Philadelphia, when it wasn't implicit or subtle racism? It was people who are using the N-word in positions of power.
What school reform looked like under Frank Rizzo was, let me see how much money we cannot give to the school district. Lest we forget, the second superintendent he appointed is the one who was known then, and I would argue still, the most inept, most corrupt superintendent the district ever had, which was Marchese, who was investigated twice for having school district employees work on his house down the shore and provide him, I want to say, security when he was off duty. That was his homie, right? And he put people in place to say, hey, don't y'all come ask me for no more money for these schools. And he did it by putting black folks in place. Right?
Say more about that, because that's an important piece here. Black people in positions of power and authority allowed him to not invest in schools. Say more about that.
It's part of the reason why I say he and Shed were two sides of the same coin, right? So Shed is telling everybody, like, yes, I'm here for the blacks. I love the blacks. And then when the phone hits the fan, he's like, hey, I don't have, just the most qualified person is the person that gets the job. I can't guarantee anything for black people. But wouldn't put, additional black people in place. Rizzo was like, y'all wanted 2 black people on the school board? I'm going to do you better. I'm going to put 3, right? But there are people who are going to do what I want. So I'm going to satisfy what you asked for. I'm going to even go above and beyond that. But, you had like a President Arthur Thomas of the school board who stopped the budget from we have to have this version of the budget where we don't ask for anything extra. The other thing you have to remember about the Rizzo era is that that's mostly when the strikes were. It's mostly when the educators in Philadelphia were striking. The last one being in 81, so right after he left.
Help me take a step back and think about this, because so many people here are watching this from different districts around the country. How does a Philadelphia case help us understand school reform patterns in urban cities around the country?
What I would say is, if you wanted to understand the pattern, I would say you have to look at the racial politics of the place you're talking about, right? So if you're trying to understand what's happening in an Oakland or San Francisco, for instance, you would have to identify, well, who are the racial key players, right? You can even start to make connections, because Marcus Foster, when he doesn't get the post in Philadelphia, he goes to San Francisco, right? So Philadelphia wouldn't sort of promote him, but San Francisco brings him in. And so my question is, why? Like, why are they willing to bring in this black man from Philadelphia, and who were the key players there? Right? In what ways did it sort of advantage the state to bring in somebody like a Marcus Foster, right? I would say if you're looking at New York, you need to look at what are the racial politics of an area like that, right? We know that district is massive. And so you have the boroughs, but then within boroughs, you have these districts. And so you have to look at the federal, state, and local politics to see sort of who are the key players and what's happening there. And I think that's what this book tries to outline. It's not just one thing. It's never just the policy, but it's the people who came up with the policy, the people who are tasked with implementing the policy, and what the policy is supposed to, what it's in response to, right? Are we talking about federal? Are we talking about state? When, for instance, No Child Left Behind becomes the law of the land in the United States, it's also the same time the school district of Philadelphia was taken over by the state. So you have these people in Philly who for decades had been begging the state, give us more money. Our people have extreme needs. You're not giving us the money we need to meet their needs, right? And they're saying, no, we can't help you. You need to just do better. But when the federal, now George Bush and his compassionate conservatism, allegedly, right, with No Child Left Behind, and he wants to interrogate the soft bigotry of low expectations. And he's going to raise these expectations just by having higher test scores for everybody, which people responded to by lying and changing state standards and all types of stuff. But that's a whole other thing. But you have his federal legislation in the state saying, all right, we're going to take over Philadelphia. We're going to give you the money you asked for, but you can't manage the money. We're going to manage the money. And instead of the money actually being here for you, they turn the district into a funnel of sorts, right? So where the money comes from the state, but it goes right back out into corporations and alleged nonprofits so they could get rich off the alleged failure of the Black and brown students in Philadelphia, because they're all coming in with their expensive interventions, right? So that's where we see racial capitalism sort of at its worst. But we got it because of the intervention of the federal government and of the state and of the local implementation of those sort of policies and forces.
One of the things you talk about in the book is, and you started to talk about it tonight, is this way that leadership remained white despite people having a commitment allegedly to Black education and to seeing sort of Black advancement at the administrative level. And then there's a moment, and this is before my time, but I think it's in your era, with Constance Clayton, right? If you grew up in Philadelphia in the 80s, Dr. Clayton, or as my parents who were educators in the district, just said Connie, you know, when she wasn't around, you wouldn't say that to her, but Dr. Clayton was the boss. What did it mean for there to be a Black woman at the helm, both in terms of sort of what she specifically did, but also kind of a bigger picture thing of like what it means to have Black people in charge of these cities? Because suddenly in the 80s and 90s, we started to see, like you said, Marcus Foster didn't get the job here, but he got the job in San Francisco. You had here. We could go around the country and see these Black people who are suddenly promoted to leadership positions in districts. Help us make sense of this.
Well, I before we talk about Clayton, I need to mention Barbara Sizemore, who was the first Black woman superintendent of DC schools, right? But only lasts for 2 years, right? The Clayton moment is interesting because she comes in 83. And, you know, as a child of the early 80s, I feel like we saw this research, this sort of very visible Black excellence. Now, I know one of your best friends, you know, y'all had a little falling out, but you and Dr. Bill Cosby, you know, y'all got the best of friends in there. But Bill Cosby was, you know, the Cosby Show starts in 84. We have Oprah, you know, starting, and she brings us The Color Purple. Like, I literally remember dropping my mother and grandmother off at the movie theater down near Penn's Landing with the line wrapped around the corner, you know, to see The Color Purple and Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah Winfrey. And so that moment, and Philly at the time, Constance Clayton comes in 83, and then in 84. 84?
Yeah.
I think it was 84. Wilson Good becomes the mayor. I think, yeah, 80 to
85. I think
80,
Wilson was 80.
84 to 92, because that 92 is when Rendell comes in, right? So you have her, you have, I think it was Willie Williams, who was in charge of the police force. I forget that Harold, somebody I think was in charge of the fire department, you know, at some point. And so it was this great moment, I think, of people looking like, wow, we made it. Mama, we made it. But, you know, unfortunately, I think some of us get way too satisfied and too complacent with the veneer of success, individual success, as opposed to community uplift and improvement for most, you know. And so I would argue that Constance Clayton meant a lot to us children who knew her name. I didn't come into district schools until 89, but I knew who she was. You know, I was in private school before that, but in 89 as a 7th grader at Pepper, you know, we gonna have to go to school tomorrow. Y'all know Constance Clayton gonna make us go to school tomorrow. You know she don't play.
We still talk about it. When these kids got 10 days off for 1 inch of snow, we'd be like, Connie Clayton, when it did that shit, it had us walking through 8 inches of snow, which is true. So
pretty much.
And Melissa lost her. She's a legend.
And there were the women who called themselves Connie's girls, right? Who sort of saw her move up higher and say, you know, I can do that. Let me follow in her footsteps. So I think, you know, it's almost like this generation's Barack Obama moment, right? Thinking about him on not inauguration night, but the election night, talking about if there's anybody out there who thinks, you know, that sort of thing. The hard part, I think, is when we look back on Dr. Clayton's leadership. I struggle to believe there would have been someone better. And at the same time, what we have to remember is that these systems are machines. They're already set to operate in a certain way. Right. And so as much as she tried to disrupt the machine for the masses, there was always huge pushback and cost for her. So her modified desegregation plan did not rapidly improve things for the masses of Black students. Right. When the city council wouldn't give any more money in, I think, 88, and she said something about historically privileged, and these white people in the Northeast are called, you know, death threats and calling for her to resign and all of this sort of stuff. Like anything she tried to do to disrupt the system, that system was ready to take her out at any moment. And so that, I argue, is part of the struggle that I think we have to remember for those of us who are so upwardly mobile. There's a cost to that. And if we're not willing to pay that cost and to fight that fight, it would be better for us to step aside or just to stop lying that we're there for community uplift, because we're not. In that instance, we're there for ourselves. And I would argue that she was trying to uplift, but I'm not sure. I don't know. We have the benefit of looking back, right? And I don't know if at the time in the 80s, if she, you know, I think she did better than I know she did better than what we had before her. And what I would say is that it in many ways, it still wasn't enough, right? Which is hard.
What's Anglo-normativity?
Anglo-normativity is when we center and hold up whiteness as the standard bearer. So in the discourse in our communities, you might hear people say, you know, Black people don't stick together enough. You know why these white people have this? Because white people do this, white people do that, right? It's the idea that white people's water is wetter, their air is, you know, their ice is colder, their air is sweeter, everything that white people has is better. And so somehow we need to measure ourselves or our success or our work by what they do, right? This book specifically aims to disrupt Anglo-normativity.
One of the things that happens after Constance Clayton leaves is that there's a major reform again.
Yeah.
I remember being in high school and feeling like school was just different when Hornbeck comes in. Help me understand why that era, because it's not just that he was a different leader, he was also bringing in, as I understand from your book, a different approach to reform, a different educational philosophy, but one that he wasn't singular in that way. He was representing an entire trend.
Not only was he representing the trend, he had been working on this plan for years elsewhere. So he had been working on it in Maryland when he was the head of MSDE. You know, I'm in Maryland now, and I was a teacher in Maryland. So when I get to Baltimore in 1999 and I have to do a demonstrated student achievement portfolio, as all teachers in Baltimore City had to do, that nobody else in the state of Maryland had to do, like that is a direct descendant of the Maryland State Department of Education Hornbeck oversaw. Hornbeck also had influence in the state of Kentucky, where they had sort of done all these different education reforms. And after he had been honing these sort of, you know, tweaking these plans around what type of things do we need to change to make a difference for young people, he tries, before he comes to Philly, he tries to be superintendent of schools in Baltimore. And I want to say it was Kurt Schmoke in Baltimore that was like, we can't do it. I believe Schmoke was the mayor at the time and was like, listen, I mean, I like your plans, but I can't bring no white man in here to run this school district. And so his opportunity comes when, you know, Constance Clayton leaves and Philly becomes open. Hornbeck gets in Philly because these white people were mad at Constance Clayton and black people and Wilson Good. They felt like we had gotten too big for our britches. They felt like we were, you know, moving on up a little bit too much. And so they're like, we need to bring in this white man. And so that's why they get David Hornbeck. Now, David Hornbeck was like, yeah, I'm not your person, right? I'm not here for you. But David Hornbeck, I think, was in an interesting sort of weird space where, like Shed, he believed, and I would say to this day, he sees himself as an advocate. I think he sees himself as an advocate for Black folks. I think sometimes in our missionary zeal, we forget that you can't denigrate the people you claim to be an advocate for, right? Those things don't go together. And even if you're not denigrating Black children, but you have a problem with their Black teachers or their Black family, then you may as well be denigrating them, right? And I think it took Hornbeck kind of a minute to get his footing in Philadelphia. He took this position of like the moral high ground, right? Like being right and being righteous is enough. And there are a lot of things I think that he was right on. But people weren't trying to hear it. They were like, we just had this Black woman and you coming in here after her. And, you know, they knew that a white man was chosen on purpose to sort of put Black educators back in their place. And so some of the buy-in he may have had, if those weren't the politics, he didn't initially get.
But there also was a way, it seems, that some of the reforms that he brought in, and this is something, again, we see consistent today, again, seem to be race neutral, but were having a particular impact on Black students and also Black teachers. The critiques of way students are being educated seem to be directed at Black, at least it felt that way at Black teachers. And the people who were going to be disrupted by some of his classroom-based interventions, curriculum-based interventions, whether it's getting rid of mainstreaming or mainstreaming more rather than having these kind of specialized classrooms. All of these things seem to be making it harder for Black children to achieve at the highest levels. That's how it was perceived. I don't know if that perception is fair or not, but that was part of the perception of Hornbeck was that Connie Clayton was at least working to have Black administrators, Black principals, Black, you know, and to make sure that Black students could succeed. And now suddenly this white man was coming in and under the guise of making everything fair and raising standards was actually making it harder for everybody. At least everybody Black.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I would say that was the perception, right? But even some of the Black educators I interviewed would say that was merely the perception of people who were caught up in the Constance Clayton hype. So one of the biggest things that people critiqued Hornbeck for was this idea that he wanted to dismantle special admission schools. I graduated from a special admission school. You graduated from a special admission school. Right. Central would be up here and down here. But, you know, he wasn't saying that he wanted to dismantle them. He said that they got an inordinate amount of resources at those special admission schools, which was true, in part due to our alumni associations being able to fund those schools in those ways. Right. And so he wanted to bring up the funding and the resources for comprehensive neighborhood schools. Right. And I think it's a difficult balance. You know, I had an article in the Enquirer where I argued that we do need to make sure students who have the least resources from the most sort of economically challenged neighborhoods in Philadelphia should have spots reserved for them at our city's top schools, right? But then I got a whole bunch of people mad at me. They were sending me angry emails and if y'all watching, I ain't read your email. I saw your name and subject and I was like, I ain't doing this with my life. But no, like I have better things to do. But you know, I see both sides of the argument, right? Because many Black educators were like, so what's going to happen if we just send all of our top kids to, you know, Germantown, King, Overbrook, Ben Franklin? Oh God, what was why am I forgetting the name of schools now? This is what happened when you old. Broad Street, Broad and Master.
Capital. Broad and Master. FLC.
Not FLC, around the corner from FLC.
Franklin?
They got both in like
Franklin is FLC. Broad Master?
Yeah. It was an all-girls school for years. It's where Ruth Hare was the first principal there.
Oh, William Penn.
Yes, William Penn, right? So if you send our best and our brightest to neighborhood schools, what will happen to them? And I think that's a valid question for the moment we were dealing with in the late 90s, right? I don't think the answer is that we just, I think that kids need to have opportunities for excellent education, regardless of where they are. What that looks like, I think we can have conversations and should have conversations about that. But a lot of people weren't open to Hornbeck having that conversation because he was perceived as somebody who was there to advocate for white people and who didn't really care about Black children or their Black educators.
I want to, everybody, by the way, in the remaining time, I want to take questions from y'all. So please hit that ask a question button and make sure you ask questions. But in the meantime, Camika, let me ask you one more question. What is Black neoliberal leadership?
Why are you trying to get the people mad at me? So in the last chapter of the book, I look at Arlene Ackerman and Bill Hite. Arlene Ackerman, who I got to shadow and had passed away. She was in the district from 2008 to 2011, and then she passed away in 2013. I think Black neoliberal leadership represents the conundrums that we all exist in, right? I see Obama as probably our chief Black neoliberal. I argue in the book that Ackerman and Hite were brought in to give the veneer of representation while implementing these very destructive programs and reforms in Philadelphia. They were imported reform. They knew little to nothing about Philadelphia before they got there. They had a playbook from the Broad Foundation when they came, and they decided to use Philadelphia as a lab to merely implement what they had learned from the Broad Institute. So what I see as neoliberalism, this sort of outsourcing of goods and services, right, to people who, there was a time when, you talk about like trash services and pickup, and people could become middle class. You think about the show Rock when we were growing up, right? You could buy a home, right, from somebody who worked for the city and provided a service for the city, and they were unionized and all this stuff. We saw a lot of that disappear and dissipate, even when it comes down to our leadership. And so that's what I take up in the last chapter of the book. And that's also when we see destruction, right? We see the closing of 30 schools and the selling off of our buildings for amounts that made absolutely no sense. And I would argue that it's more painful when it comes from us, from people who look like us.
I could see that.
When we allow ourselves to be used by these systems for our individual improvement and gain, right? For the harm of those who look like us, who we say we're working on behalf of.
There's a way that market logic seems to prevail for everything we do now. I just hear the word efficiency, and I hear everything is so technocratic. Everything is, is there something, and there would be some people, particularly in the educational left, who would argue that the obsession with neoliberalism, the obsession with kind of capitalist logic is even more influential than race. How do you see these dynamics, these structures, these discourses playing out together? In other words, how do we think through the kind of neoliberal moment we're in against the backdrop of a white supremacist state, or vice versa? How do we understand racism against the backdrop of a capitalist state?
Yeah. It kind of pains me when I feel like people who should be allies, and I'm thinking of white folks who identify themselves as socialists or democratic socialists, don't have a racial analysis, right? America was, it is impossible for anything in this country not to have some connection to race. This country is a racial project, and it continues to be a racial project. Now, there are absolutely but it's also a capitalist project. Those two things are intertwined, and there is no separation of them. I think for people it depends on who's in power, right? So it could be somebody who has specific aims around capital, who are using our racial identities and using race as a tool to deliver on their capitalist aims. Then there's also those, I think, who operate from a white supremacist framework, who use the ideas of the market to achieve their white supremacist aims. You understand? I don't think they can be separated. And I think those of us who are for justice, I think that we harm ourselves when we try to take a frame that eliminates the economics of the situation, but also the race-basedness of the situation.
I got some questions coming in from people in the audience, so we're gonna go to them.
Okay.
One of them is from Alicia, and she says, "School District of Philadelphia seems to be in shambles. How might the new superintendent begin to make progress, and how do we pressure him to center Black students and families in that progress?"
In shambles. So it's hard for me as somebody who looks at the district historically to be like, this moment is in shambles, right? Because I'm like, it's not 30 schools closed. You know what I mean? But I'm not going to say that it's not, right? Because we just have a different vantage point. And also, we're also like still in the middle of this COVID moment. So being in shambles makes sense, especially when I understand district schools had to close today because many of them were too hot to keep going, right? How in 2022, you know the sun is going to come out every year and from like May until September. How you don't plan for air, something as simple as air, I don't know, right? Unless you just don't care, which in some ways it seems like when they had asbestos floating around Masterman, if you don't care about them kids at Masterman, you know, kids at Bartram don't have a chance. How do you get the superintendent to advocate for Black children? I mean, honestly, I think in this context, from the perspective of the superintendent, that actually has to be private advocacy, because I think you put the superintendent in an awkward position where they're supposed to represent the entire district and say, I need you to, you know, prioritize Black children, right? Like you can say that to him. He can't say that to everybody else. Like, hey, I'm gonna prioritize Black children. Because you also have to remember that he exists in a context. And part of his context is working with the legislature for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And how would that type of thing, you know, how would that sort of resonate out in Western Pennsylvania where they get to make decisions about what happens in Philadelphia? So I think trying to figure out ways where educators in Philadelphia and parents in Philadelphia can get the superintendent's ear that are outside of cameras would be the way to implore him around the plight of Black children in the district.
I'm going to go to Nyla's question in 1 second, but I want to ask you one more question about sort of your method of getting here, because there's some people here who are graduate students, some people who are doing different kinds of research, who are, trained faculty, and there's some independent scholars out there. You know, so many people who do educational research do qualitative interviews. Yeah. And you made a decision a long time ago that wasn't going to be what this project was. You are a historian of education. What did it take to do? And I don't give that title away easily.
I don't call myself a historian of education now. You're not going to have the people from the Ed History Society mad at me. I have not published in a history journal, so I am not a historian.
Well, you just published a whole history book, so I'm gonna call you.
It's not a history book, though. It's not, right?
Break it down.
Okay. So when I was going back and forth with my publisher, which is Harvard Education Press, my lovely editor, Jane Farnioli, who I know you know, there were some things about one of the chapters or maybe the proposal I sent, and she said, if you want to go in this direction, you'll need to find, you should publish it with a press that does history. That would be like a University of North Carolina press or University of Pennsylvania press, right? They are known for doing UNC for straight history, UPenn for education history, all right? This is more a book that looks at the politics of reform over a period of time, which is not the same thing as doing straight up history. Now, I did take as my central sort of data, the minutes from the Board of Education and the School Reform Commission. So starting in 2018, I went down to 440 North Broad Street and I went to a little room and I sat there looking at these books that had notes from meetings, right? From the minutes from their meetings.
How far far back did these minutes go? How many years back does this go?
Do they go, or the ones that I looked at?
Both.
They probably have them from, I want to say they have them from the early 20th century. So my history, I don't go back that far. I started in 1963.
So you read the minutes of meetings from 1963 up to 2000 and is it 8? No.
18 and 18. Yes, I did. Sometimes I was bored out my damn mind. Yes.
Wow.
And so what I did too, because I have this nifty little, I have to figure out what I'm gonna do with it now. So I got this iPad that my job paid for. Shout out to my job. Where I would snap pictures of the pages because the minutes are not online. They exist only in this office at 440 North Broad Street in the office of the General Counsel. And so I would sort of skim and scan, where do I see people talking about things that have to do with race, have to do about reform. And as I would see them, I would snap a picture of the page. And so I, would just I have all these pages saved on that iPad. And then I came back and printed them out and organized them. And I read through them, sort of making highlights and notes and codes around, what themes were emerging, what were the things around racial school reform and the politics of reform that I saw sort of coming through there. I did also interview, oh God, I can't even remember. I've been working on this thing for so long, I can't remember. It was like 30 people, 30, 35, 36, something like that, different people. And most were Black educators who had worked in the district through at least 2 superintendents. And then I interviewed a set of people that I called witnesses, people who were activists or some other type of educator with the district who and I used them to, in some ways, corroborate the stories that I was hearing from Black educators, but also to sort of verify what I was finding in the minutes. Right. A great example of this is one of the Black educators I interviewed told me about this Constance Clayton moment. She said, she said something and it really rubbed people the wrong way. Now, my memory, I'm like, well, hell, I was a kid, but I don't remember this moment she's talking about. I interviewed Constance Clayton. Constance Clayton don't mention no moment, right? So she don't mention it, I don't mention it. But then when I start looking in the Philadelphia Tribune, I'm like, wait a minute. This must be, so then after the Tribune, then I go to, the Daily News and the Inquirer, and I'm like, oh, this was the moment. And then I have to start peeling back, from city council and all this stuff, like what did that represent and why were so many people pissed off about it?
Yeah. So I'm reading your manuscript, and I've read a few drafts of it at this point when I'm reading it, and I'm amazed at the fact that you got minutes from meetings from 40 years ago. You got newspaper articles, you got interviews. I mean, the amount of archival work and contemporary work that you were able to put together, I think, is really overwhelming and astounding. It's impressive.
It's overwhelming.
I'm about to say, I had to be overwhelming for you because it was incredibly overwhelming for me just to read. I was like, ooh, she went in, and too often I read these books and there's like 4 endnotes. Meanwhile, yours chapters, you in the hundreds, and it's just so incredibly rigorous and thoughtful and well developed, and I hope people appreciate it because sometimes when somebody writes an amazing text and the narrative is as clear as yours is and the writing is as beautiful as yours is, people underestimate how much work it is. It's like it's seamless, right? You don't show the seams, but it's there. The theory is there. You know what I mean? To put it crudely, my grandmama would say, like, let me not do that. I'll just say that you have you have an incredible analysis here that's woven through. I'm going to take a question. I'm going to take Nyla's question, and Nyla says, you mentioned the importance of the local racial, social, and political context in influencing school reform. I assume you'd agree that those dynamics also matter when trying to advance racial equity and justice in public schools. She says, as someone who provides TA and PD to schools in a wide variety of urban, suburban, and rural school districts, can you recommend any frameworks or tools that can help delineate how different racial, social, and political environments should inform one's approach to advancing racial equity in schools? And if not, could you consider creating one?
I would say I would consider creating one. But the professor in me starts to think, I don't think about framework. I think about asking questions and getting information about who are the key players, what's happening where, right? Who has power? What does it look like? What's the population at this school? What's the perception of this population? What are the dynamics between the students with each other? What are the dynamics between the parents and the faculty, between the leadership and the faculty and the parents? Like, those are all things that I begin to wonder about, so that you can start to understand what dynamics are at play and what equity would even mean in the context of wherever you're working with. So, like, recently last week I did a professional development session for a school in Montclair, New Jersey. And part of my preparation for that, right? I don't have any ties to Montclair, New Jersey. In fact, when the PTA first approached me, I was like, I have some wonderful colleagues at Montclair State. You know what I'm saying? Like, go get Bree Pickauer, get Tanya Maloney. I think they would be amazing to do this work. And they said, well, some people did their master's degrees there. And so we want to get, a fresh perspective. But I had to learn some things. And but still, if we do continue, because we're talking about continuing, but there's more information I would need to gather about the dynamics in, Montclair. And I think that becomes really, you can't advocate for equity in a place without knowing what the history has been like in that place and the history of the people, right? Who has benefited from the way things are set up, right? And who's been shut out, who's been marginalized, who's been censored, who's been harmed. What does that harm look like, right? And what ways is your equity trying to repair that harm, right? How are you sort of passing the mic along to others, And I think about that with all of our districts. I saw an analysis of Uvalde that talked about the north part of the city and the south part of the city, and the north part of the city being all white people, and they run the politics and they run the police force. And the south part of the city is all, Latinx, Mexican folks and folks from Central America, right? And sort of what that means for why that police department perhaps waited 90 minutes before going into that school. You can't separate those things out.
We had a question coming in from Lisa Haver. Actually, let me jump to Dave's question first. We're going to get to both of them. I just want to. There's a through line here. Dave says, from a historical perspective, having focused on superintendents and school district leaders, do you think it's possible for the structures they lead to act on behalf of Black working class in Philly in the midst of larger forces of American racial capitalism, or are they fully captured and complicit with injustice beyond hope?
Well, so here's the thing. I would say nothing is beyond hope, and I would say these structures are not set up for working class Black and brown people. I would argue that you need a superintendent who at least is not going to be obstructionist, right? So the people on the ground can get done work that needs to be done. The structure is the structure, and you're always going to have a superintendent or somebody like that to lead, and you're going to have school board members who are trying to, use that post to get to the next thing or whatever. But my highest hope would be to have a superintendent who lets the people on the ground who are doing the organizing and the building actually accomplish something, to not stop them from making progress from the people who have been the most marginalized, the most deprioritized, the most sort of removed from the means of their production. And from the accumulation of capital.
That's a great answer. Let's move on to, now we can get to Lisa's question as well, which is, I'm trying to pull up my little screen. There we go. How do we get the board to listen to and act on the needs of the community? And this is a very Philadelphia specific question, but I think there's also a way that speaks to the challenges that people have in cities all around the country, right? How do we get the board to listen and act on the needs of community?
The last time somebody asked me about this, somebody in the audience was like, no, because I was into such and such. So first of all, I think Philadelphia needs to have an elected school board. I really do. And I understand that people are concerned that if we have an elected school board, that there will be money coming in from all types of places to sort of to control who goes on that school board. But the way that you get a board to listen is for them to be accountable to the people, and this board is not accountable to the people. So that's where I would start. Historically, people have used being on the school board as a springboard for the next thing. So it's not surprising to me that they don't listen to the people. They haven't been set up that way. But the first way you get them to listen is not by having, I'm really going to try to watch my mouth here, but not by having some, these appointments that the mayor does, but by having an elected school board. If you can have, maybe I'm just not smart enough. Maybe I don't know enough to why you can have all these sort of city council seats that come from across the city, but you can't have school board seats in the same way, right? Like I don't really understand that.
It makes absolutely no sense to me either, particularly since we have the same consistent complaint and concern about how school boards are not responsive to the needs of community. We got one more question before we go, and it is from Gloria Jean Royster.
That's my cousin.
Okay, cousin. What is your experience with how Black history is presented in urban schools? I live in Florida. I am writing 2 books about Tampa female pioneers who were once enslaved. I am being told to be mindful and careful because of the pushback from our governor regarding critical race theory. Now, I mean, it's an interesting question, particularly given the fact that school reform right now, unfortunately, in many cities around the country, and you and I have talked about this in a variety of platforms, is being sort of animated by this fear of race talk. They don't say that, but it seems to me that whether it's the 1619 Project infiltrating the curriculum, or children's books that may actually tell kids that they're Black, or whether it's the mention of race or any kind of race dialogue, or talk about whiteness or white power, white privilege, all of these things are being not just sort of decried, but they're being legislated out of the curriculum to the point that you almost can't talk about race in school, and that's being mixed with a kind of aversion to any kind of historical analysis in school. So, like, I mean, this is in some ways, this moment is scarier than some of the moments you talk about in 1967, 1971. How are you making sense of all this? And to Gloria's question, like, what's your experience with how this stuff is being presented in urban schools?
Well, how it's being presented, I think it depends on how subversive the teachers are and what risks the teachers themselves are willing to take on and what risk is posed, right? Here's the honest to God truth. This is my 23rd year. This is my 23rd year as an educator. And I have to say, the longer I study schools, the more I hate them. So before we get to this moment where critical race theory is the alleged boogeyman, I have an article with a sister from Morgan State University where we talk about, as people sort of were focused more on test scores, that meant things like culturally relevant pedagogy sort of got pushed to the back because all the focus has to be on student achievement through test scores. We can't do socio-political consciousness. We can't do cultural competence, right? And so teachers sort of have to go underground with those things. And I would say if you're concerned in a place like Florida with DeSantis, or you're concerned in Virginia where they have a hotline, I think it calls to report teachers.
A hotline.
Yeah, you got a hotline. You don't have a hotline to report these people with these AR-15s, but you got a hotline for some teachers, right? So I would say, our educators have to be willing in some ways to be subversive with it, right? Which poses great risk to them. But I would also say this is why we have to be organizing in community outside of schools. This is where our Saturday schools, our Sunday meetings, our after school time in community becomes super important. Because we do have these governments that are saying, you can't do this. And it's not new, this imposition of what can, and it's not just domestic. So I don't know if you remember, Mark, when we were when I went on the delegation with you to Palestine.
Yeah.
And we were talking to children about what they learn. Right, what Palestinian children are able to learn in schools that are technically Israeli, what they learn about who they are. The government has always, and will always try to use curriculum to control people, to tamper down what they know about themselves and what they believe about their own freedom. But I mean, it calls on us. I wouldn't say that means don't write the book. I would say that means that you're going to have to write the book, but also figure out who you need to partner with and how, so that information is getting to our children, whether it's in schools or whether it's in churches, whether it's in masjids, whether it's in synagogues, whether it's in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts or some other Alima Scouts, whatever it is, not just through our schools.
Absolutely. So, I know. Camika, you got time for a couple, just two more quick questions?
Why not? You got time?
I'll make time for you. Come on now.
If you got time, I got time. Come on.
We've been waiting years for this book. This
whole miracle.
Yeah, we're gonna rejoice in it. Let's see here. What advice do you have for social justice minded teachers and parents of Black children in the district? Should we divest? Do you think having more Black teachers would help? It's a fascinating question.
I think it's both and. Right. I think having more Black teachers would help, but I also think we have to be careful what those Black teachers know of themselves, because I just talked about the ways curriculum is used to shape educators. If you look at James Anderson's book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1865 to 1930, there's a quote in there from a general, Armstrong, who had fought in the Civil War and then helps to found Hampton. And his quote is, "Let us make the teachers and we will make the people." And what they were doing at the Hampton Institute training Black educators then was putting us in the fields. So these Black families post-slavery, right, in this Reconstruction era, would put their little pennies together and send their best and their brightest to Hampton to learn how to be teachers. And these crackers, these liberal crackers, decided the best way to teach these young Black people to be teachers was to put them back in the field. So my point is that yes, we need more Black teachers, but we need to be very careful what those Black teachers are being taught, what they believe, because there are some of us who are espousing these very anti-Black Anglo-normative frameworks and ideas about our own children, about our own colleagues, and in some ways about ourselves. Should we divest? I don't know what divesting would mean, right? So I do think there's an organization that has to happen outside of schools, but also as an American, right? As somebody who lives here, you pay taxes. This government, we pay for this government to be responsive to us. That's our money. Those are our schools, right? And so we have a claim. It is within us to make a demand on what this government does in the schooling it provides for our children, right? So I think it has to be both and. I think that doesn't negate the organizing and the teaching that has to happen with our children outside of the formal school system.
Okay. And the last question, I'm going to go to Stuart Roden, another alum.
Hey, Stuart.
Of Temple University's urban education program. So shout out to him. I'm not in that program no more because, interesting politics there with the dean, but I love the students and the faculty there. As you pointed out, knowing the history of a community or city is important to the educational outcomes of Black students and students of color. How can colleges and universities collaborate to help foster and improve that institutional and historical knowledge for both the school board and superintendents?
I think that's an interesting question, right? I would say, first of all, your school board and superintendent have to be open to that knowledge. And I don't know that that's always the case. I think it depends on who you're working with, right? And what they're interested in knowing. I remember when I got to Philadelphia, because this work was ongoing. So Hike came in 10 years ago, and I had people, I would do a professional development. People were like, "Does Dr. Hike know that you have all this information?" I'd be like, "I met him." well, how is he engaging you? Right? People have to be open to that information.
Right.
I also think that universities have to be very careful because, universities tend to be colonizers. So what I heard in Stuart is this idea that we could provide knowledge when the fact is there's a lot of knowledge we as university folk have to learn from community people to make sure we're not being complicit in the destruction that universities often create for communities.
Yes, that is a key. I mean, I might even go so far as to argue universities are always colonizers, and our job is to resist. And one of the tools I think that we have to resist is the production of knowledge. And this book that you've given us is an extraordinary contribution to how we think about the history of our resistance effort, the history of our struggle, the resistance of our attempts to reform a system that may not even be reformable ultimately. but it also gives us pathways forward. This isn't just a backwards looking book. This is a book that gives us analysis, and it gives us hope, and it gives us direction. It's not a book of instructions. It's not a how-to guide, but it also gives us tactics and strategies for moving forward. This book is really a major contribution to our knowledge base. I think that anyone out there who teaches the history of ed reform, if you're using ghetto schooling, keep using ghetto schooling. That's a canonical text at this point. But you got to add "not paid for us" to it. If you're teaching the education of blacks in the South, you got to keep doing it. That is our historical Bible. But you got to add this to it. This book is one of the most important books on education reform and black education reform that has been produced. It's not a coincidence that it's on Harvard Press. It's not a coincidence that the book has been reviewed so rigorously and so beautifully. And everything you've heard today is only a reflection, really a small reflection of the brilliance that's in the book. All the brilliance tonight is just a slice of the brilliance that's in this book. So I encourage everybody to buy this book, to read this book, to teach this book, to share this book, and to engage in principled, careful, loving action as an off jump from this book. Camika, again, I'm so proud of you as my friend. I could brag about you and say I was her advisor. I'm grateful for everything you contributed to what we know in the world and who you are in the world and how you move in the world. I love you. I'm grateful for you, and just thank you so much for everything, but especially for tonight.
Thank you. You're not gonna make me cry.
That's right. We two thugs up in here. Everybody, the book is called "Not Paid For Us." You can click that green button down there and buy it. Now, I know you could probably buy it for like 42 cents cheaper at Amazon, but don't do that. So you're going to independent black bookstores. You're going to buy it from Uncle Bobbie's Coffee and Books right now. If you don't want to buy it from us because you don't like me, that's cool. Go to Mahogany Books. Go to Hakeem's. Go to Marcus Book. Go to any black bookstore. Go, there you go. Go anywhere. Harriet's bookstore. That's my sister. Go there. Go anywhere, but support an independent black bookstore. We can't talk all this black resistance for an hour and then buy it from from Jeff Bezos. So look, everybody, I wish you a great night of peace and love and strategy and action and resistance. Camika, I'll talk to you soon. Everybody have a good night from Uncle Bobbie's. Peace.
Thank you.